We're focusing today on a really profound tragedy, a horrifying example of a crime planned purely for the sake of notoriety. This is our analysis of the background, the crime itself, and the extensive legal aftermath of the 2006 murder of 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart in Pocatello, Idaho.
It's so important that we approach this review of the sources with a lot of gravity and empathy. Cassie Jo Stoddart was a high school junior. She was born in December of '89, just a young woman whose life was just unjustly and violently taken while she was doing something as simple as house sitting for her family.
And based on the documentation we've all reviewed, what makes this case so fundamentally chilling is how it's classified. It's a planned thrill killing, a crime committed just for excitement and fame.
Right. It wasn't some impulsive act of violence. It was meticulously planned and, really critically, it was a copycat crime.
It has these very distinct links to pop culture and to other real-world tragedies.
That's really the defining feature here, isn't it? The individuals responsible were two of her own classmates, Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamsick. Exactly. And the sources, they're very clear on this, they were inspired by the slasher film Scream. This connection to the movie later gave them that moniker, the Scream Killers, the fact that they documented their own motives and plans. It makes this a rare and just deeply disturbing case study in juvenile homicide.
So our purpose here in going through these sources is to really examine the circumstances that allowed this to happen on September 22, 2006. We want to look at the investigation that came after and the very complex legal battles that have followed the perpetrators' convictions for over a decade now. We want to give you a comprehensive, fact-based understanding of the official record.
So let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack the origins of this dark ambition. Let's establish the relationship between Cassie Jo and her killers and the mindset they were building together.
Okay, so Brian Draper, he had moved to Pocatello from Utah.
Yeah.
And Tori Adamsick was a local, a Pocatello native. They meet as sophomores at Pocatello High School.
Right. And all three of them, Cassie, Brian, and Tori, they were all 11th graders when the murder happened. We know from the evidence that they shared an interest in movies. They liked recording their own videos.
And this shared interest, this hobby, it becomes the vessel for this horrible fantasy.
It really does. The motivation that's revealed in the sources it's just extraordinary because it's not typical criminal thinking. They weren't after revenge or money or anything like that. The documents say the boys were seeking fame and pleasure.
Fame and pleasure.
Yeah, a thrill and a notoriety they felt they could only get by going on a killing spree. This was premeditated violence aimed entirely at getting status, at getting infamy, proving they could do these horrific things.
And their main inspiration, it wasn't just fictional characters like, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher from Scream.
Yeah.
The documents show they were trying to put themselves into a terrifying real-world hierarchy of violence.
That is the most disturbing layer, I think. The tapes and the writings that were recovered, they explicitly show their ambition to outdo Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold.
The Columbine perpetrators.
Yes. They mention Harris and Klebold over and over in their homemade videos. They were essentially creating this twisted manifesto where they detailed their plan to surpass previous acts of mass violence. There were even reports that they were planning a much bigger, a Columbine-like shooting event at their school.
So the murder of Cassie Jo Stoddart, it was basically an audition.
Yeah.
An audition for a much larger, much more terrifying plan.
That's a perfect way to put it. Precisely. The goal wasn't just one victim. It was about achieving this terrible historical status. The sources show they started a death list of other potential victims on the very same day they killed Cassie Jo.
Wow.
Yeah. Which just reinforces that she was just the first step. They were focused on fame and the documentation itself, the filming of their plans. That was a deliberate step to control their own story and make sure they got their place in this morbid history.
Before they carried out the plan, they had to pick their first targets. The sources say Draper and Adam Suchik initially chose two of their friends.
Right. Matt Beckham, who was Cassie Jo's boyfriend, and Cassie Jo Stoddart herself. They intended for the first act to be a double murder.
And the logistics of it, the preparation, it just speaks to how calculated this all was. They got the weapons in advance.
They did. One of Adam Mishik's friends, a kid named Joe Lucero, he testified in court about it. He gave these really critical details about buying 4 knives for them.
And Lucero confirmed he got $45 for it. 40 from Draper, 5 from Adam Arifik. So the premeditation is just, it's undeniable. They armed themselves with lethal weapons well before the day of the crime.
And we know exactly what kind they bought. Lucero testified that one of the 4 knives was serrated, the other 3 were not. And crucially, Draper made a point of claiming that serrated knife for himself. The evidence later showed Draper had a dagger-type weapon and Adamczyk had a hunting knife. These were bought at a pawn shop. This wasn't grabbing something from a kitchen drawer. This was specific weapon acquisition for a planned murder.
The videotapes are just so important here. What exactly did those tapes show about their state of mind leading up to this?
The tapes are the smoking gun for premeditation. They recorded themselves talking about the murder in this clinical, almost excited detail. They don't sound remorseful. They don't sound hesitant. They sound gleeful about the idea of ending a life and the media coverage that would follow.
Unbelievable.
In one part, they talk about the feeling of power, the rush they expected to get. Adamczyk, he seemed really obsessed with making sure they left no evidence behind. It shows this calculating criminal mind focused on getting away with it while also maximizing the notoriety. They basically created a blueprint of their own malice.
It's like they weren't just interested in committing a crime, but in creating a performance. Something for posterity, so that when they were caught, the world would see their dark ambition.
That is the absolute core of the thrill-killing definition here. It's not about the victim. The victim is interchangeable. It's about the feeling you get from the act itself and the projected fame that comes with it. They really believed this crime would give them the legendary status they craved, even if it meant execution or life in prison.
Let's move into the detailed timeline of that night. The night of the murder, September 22nd, 2006. Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras. Their home was on Whispering Cliffs Drive in northeast Bannock County. She was there for the weekend, just looking after their dogs.
And the first few hours were completely normal. Her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, he got there around 6 p.m. to spend time with her. A bit later, Draper and Adamczyk showed up, supposedly just to hang out.
And Cassie, being friendly and trusting, gave her friends a little tour of the house, which included the basement.
Yes. And that small act of hospitality, unfortunately, gave the killers the exact knowledge of the layout they needed.
So the four of them, they're all trying to watch a movie, Kill Bill, Volume 2, in the living room. But the whole gathering was just a setup, a ruse. Adamczyk and Draper leave early, saying they're going to a movie theater.
And this moment, their departure, this is the hinge point for the entire crime. It was a planned deception. The sources are very clear that before Draper left the house, he secretly went and unlocked the basement door that led outside. That single, quiet act of unlocking a door was the premeditated step that let them get back into the home completely undetected.
Of course, they didn't go to the movie theater. They just drove it a short way away, parked the car down the street.
And got ready. They put on dark clothing, gloves, and the key props for their performance. Their white painted masks. They were getting ready to become the horror characters they idolized.
So they slip back into the house through that unlocked basement door, while Cassie, Jo, and Matt are still upstairs, completely unaware. And their attempts to lure them downstairs start almost right away.
They start by just intentionally making noise in the basement, kicking things, rattling objects, just making their presence known. They were hoping to scare the couple into coming down to investigate.
But that tactic failed.
It failed. It didn't draw them down. So that forced them to escalate their plan, which really shows their chilling commitment to the timeline they'd set for themselves.
And that escalation.
Right.
That involved going for the power.
Yes. They found the circuit breaker in the basement and just shut off the electricity to the whole house. This was completely calculated. The hope was that in the dark, Cassie and Matt would instinctively come downstairs to check the panel, which would bring them right into their ambush.
But when the darkness didn't work either, they tried something else, turning some of the lights back on for a moment. This sequence of lights off, then on again. It did exactly what they wanted it to. It just amplified that feeling of dread and vulnerability in the house.
And that dread really started to affect Cassie Jo. The sources say she was getting more and more uneasy after that temporary power outage. But we also have evidence of the dogs reacting. One of the Contreras dogs was just staring intently down the basement stairs, and it would periodically bark or growl. Animals often sense intruders long before we do, and that detail just underscores the terrifying atmosphere that was building.
Cassie Jo was clearly scared, and Matt, her boyfriend, he tried to get permission to stay over. His mom said no, but she realized Cassie was alone and frightened, so she offered to let Cassie come stay at their house for the night instead.
And this is where duty just changing. It tragically intersected with the crime. Cassie Jo declined the offer. She told Matt she felt obligated to stay, to take care of the pets she was hired to watch. That sense of responsibility, while so admirable, it meant she stayed in that house with the two killers hidden right below her.
So at about 10:30 p.m., Matt's mother comes and picks him up. and Cassie Jo Stoddart is left completely alone in the house.
And there's this one final piece of deception right as Matt is leaving. After he got in his car, he called Adam Mashik's cell phone, assuming they were at the movies. Adam Mashik answered, but Matt noted he could barely hear him because Adam Mashik was speaking in this very quiet, hushed tone.
He just assumed it was because they were sitting in a quiet movie theater.
Exactly. But in reality, Adam Mashik was whispering because he was hiding in the basement, just yards away from Cassie Jo.
Once they heard Matt's car leave, once they knew he was gone, that was it. They went right back to the circuit breaker and shut the power off again. They waited, still expecting her to come downstairs. When she still didn't move, they decided the waiting was over. They started up the stairs.
They were fully armed now. Draper had his serrated dagger, Adam Mashik had his hunting knife, and they chose to maximize the terror first. To get her attention and just shock her, Draper slammed a closet door at the top of the stairs. Cassie was lying on the couch in the living room when the attack started.
The sources described the attack as immediate and savage. They attacked her, stabbing her repeatedly. The medical exam later confirmed she had suffered approximately 30 stab wounds. It was swift, brutal, and just a targeted assault.
And crucially, the forensic evidence showed the severity of their intent. 12 of those wounds were classified as potentially fatal on their own. This shows they weren't just trying to hurt her, they were focused entirely on making sure she was dead. It reflects that instruction Draper later admitted Adam Mashik gave him, make sure she is dead. A life was just extinguished by two young men looking for a thrill and a headline.
So after Cassie Jo's body was discovered 2 days later, when her aunt and uncle came home, the investigation began. And the immediate focus, of course, fell on those who were closest to her and the crime scene. Standard police procedure.
Right, and the initial persons of interest were logical ones. One was the boyfriend of Cassie's mother, and this was due to physical evidence. His fingerprints were found on the circuit breaker door in the basement, which had obviously been tampered with.
But that lead was dismissed pretty quickly.
Very quickly. He had a straightforward and verifiable explanation. The Contreras family corroborated it. He had done some electrical work at the house a few months earlier, so he was cleared.
Then, attention turned to Matt Beckham, the last known person to see Cassie Jo alive. He was a critical witness. He was the one who confirmed that whole suspicious sequence with the lights flickering on and off. He confirmed the power had been manipulated.
But his alibi was ironclad. His mother confirmed the exact time she picked him up, and Matt also passed a polygraph test. So with him cleared, and with the evidence pointing to someone using the basement, the timeline placed Draper and Adam Mashik at the house right before it all happened. The detectives pivoted their focus entirely onto them.
In the interrogation process, that's what really revealed the tracks in their attempt to build an alibi.
Their story was just weak, and it was easily challenged. Initially, they claimed they went downtown to see a movie, Pulse. But when the detectives started asking them about it, about the plot, the characters, any details at all, they couldn't recall anything substantive.
Which is a huge red flag for investigators. If you just saw a movie, you can usually remember something about it.
Exactly. So when the pressure mounted, they changed their story completely. They claimed they'd abandoned the movie idea and instead had been going through cars in the area, looking for loose change.
Two completely different, unsupported stories.
It just heightened the suspicion immeasurably. Detectives realized they were dealing with two people who were actively lying about their whereabouts. The interrogation became much more focused, much more relentless.
And that psychological pressure, that's what led to the pivotal moment. Draper confessed.
Draper eventually broke. He confessed to the police, although he did initially try to minimize his own role in it. He claimed Adam Mashik was the main aggressor, which is a common thing you see in crimes with joint perpetrators. Each one tries to shift the blame to lessen their own sentence.
But that narrative changed when he admitted the specific details of the attack and that chilling instruction from Adam Mashik.
Yes. Draper admitted to stabbing Cassie Jo, confirming it was a joint attack. And he recalled Adam Mashik telling them, quote, make sure she is dead. And that statement, it just proved the explicit intent to kill, not just to injure.
Draper's confession was absolutely critical, not just for the admission of guilt, but because it led police right to the physical evidence they had hidden.
He led investigators straight to Black Rock Canyon. It's a remote area where they had tried to get rid of all the evidence. They had tried to burn their dark clothes, the masks, the murder weapons, and then they buried whatever was left. The police team recovered all of it.
But the real game changer in this case It was the recovery of an item the boys never intended for anyone to find.
That's the crucial piece of evidence that makes this case so unique in legal history. At Black Rock Canyon, they recovered a partially burned VHS tape. And through some painstaking work, technicians were able to restore the video footage.
And on that tape.
On that tape was a detailed record of Draper and Adamsick outlining their plans, their motives, and their intent to murder Cassie Jo Stoddart. And it also had their plans to continue a killing spree, targeting other classmates.
So this footage provided irrefutable, self-documented proof of their malice and premeditation. It just transformed the case from one that was based on a police confession, which can sometimes be challenged in court, into a case built on the killer's own recorded words.
The legal impact of that tape was profound. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the act was planned, that the motive was sinister fame and pleasure, and that the perpetrators were completely aware of what they were doing. That video became the centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. It provided this undeniable insight into the sadism, the calculation, and the thrill-seeking motive behind the murder. They essentially created a documentary of their own first-degree crime.
Draper and Adamsick were arrested on September 27, 2006. That was just 5 days after the murder. They were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Their trials were separated, right?
Yeah. They were, largely because the evidence, especially that video, was so overwhelming. It really accelerated the whole process. Draper was convicted of first-degree murder on April 17, 2007, and Adamsick was convicted on June 8, 2007. Both were found guilty on the conspiracy charge as well.
And the prosecution, they leaned heavily on that video evidence.
Absolutely. They used it to establish the cold, calculated nature of the murder. But the jury also heard a lot of testimony about the defendant's obsession with achieving notoriety, directly linking their plan to other high-profile tragedies.
Right, the Columbine connection came up in court.
It did. The prosecution introduced written evidence of Draper's obsession. A passage he wrote, titled simply Columbine, was read in court, and it revealed his mindset. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I am becoming more and more obsessed with Columbine. They are my heroes. I will follow in their footsteps, and maybe I'll even meet them."
Wow. That statement presented alongside the planning tapes. It just confirms that killing Cassie Jo wasn't an isolated act in their minds. It was a deliberate first step toward fulfilling this premeditated goal of replication, of trying to surpass previous acts of mass violence. They were trying to carve out their own infamous place in history.
Following the convictions, sentencing was on August 31st, 2007. And given the gravity of the charges, the irrefutable evidence of premeditation, both teenagers, who were 16 at the time of the crime, they received a mandatory sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. They also got an additional 30 years to life for the conspiracy conviction. They're both serving their time at the Idaho State Correctional Institution.
But even though the sentencing was finalized, the legal battles around this case went on for years. And that's largely because they were juveniles when the crime was committed, right? That introduced a level of complexity that our judicial system continues to grapple with.
This is where we have to trace this long appeal process. It really illustrates a decade of legal wrestling. The first appeals were filed at the Idaho Supreme Court around 2010 and 2011. Draper, in particular, was trying to get his sentence modified. He was arguing for a limited life sentence that would let him get parole consideration after 30 years.
And how did the Idaho Supreme Court rule on that?
It was a narrow decision, 3-2, but they ultimately upheld the first-degree murder convictions and the life sentences without parole for both of them.
So no change to the life sentence?
No, but there was a small technical win for Draper at that stage. The Supreme Court did vacate his specific conviction for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. They ruled that the jurors had been given erroneous legal instructions on that one specific charge. It's really important to note, though, that his life sentence for the murder itself remained completely unchanged.
The legal challenges kept coming, though, and they focused heavily on Adamsick. In 2015, there was a hearing for post-conviction relief.
Right. Adam Soloshick's defense team argued that his initial trial attorney had been ineffective because he failed to call character witnesses during the sentencing phase. The argument was that, maybe testimony from these witnesses could have persuaded the judge to give a different sentence.
So it raises this crucial question: was the original lawyer providing an adequate defense?
Exactly. Judge Mitchell W. Brown, who presided over the hearing, he denied the request in 2016. The judge noted that the first attorney had made a strategic decision not to call those witnesses. He believed that if he had, it would have opened the door for the prosecution to bring in even more damaging, aggravating evidence about Adam Salchik's dark fantasies. It could have potentially harmed his case more than it helped.
Adam Mushik appealed that denial, of course.
He did to the Idaho Supreme Court, but in 2017, they rejected his appeal. They upheld the lower court's ruling, agreeing that the original attorney's decision was a rational, if risky, trial strategy.
And this all leads to the final, really critical stage of the legal challenge, which involved landmark U.S. Supreme Court rulings about juvenile sentencing.
It does. In January 2018, Adam Rasick's counsel filed a federal writ of habeas corpus.
So for anyone who might not know, a writ of habeas corpus, it literally means produce the body. It's a legal action where someone can report an unlawful imprisonment to a federal court. You're basically challenging a state conviction on constitutional grounds. And in this case, the challenge was focused squarely on his juvenile life sentence.
Exactly. The appeal argued his sentence should be reconsidered based on the Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana Supreme Court decisions. The Miller ruling from 2012 established that a mandatory life without parole sentence for a juvenile violates the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment. It requires judges to consider the defendant's youth before imposing that sentence. And then Montgomery later clarified that Miller applies retroactively.
So the defense was essentially arguing that even if the crime was horrific, the original 2007 sentencing didn't give enough individualized consideration to Adam Rasick's status as a 16-year-old.
That was the core of the argument. However, federal magistrate judge Candy W. Dale denied the writ in 2019. The court found that the Idaho State Court had given sufficient individualized consideration and that the sentence was appropriate, given the extreme premeditation shown on the planning tapes. It was evidence of a calculating adult mind operating within a juvenile body.
And that denial was then appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very high level of review.
It is. And in March of 2022, the Ninth Circuit also upheld the original sentence of life without parole. This whole sequence of rulings across state and federal systems, it just underscores the profound judicial weight that was given to the evidence of premeditation in this specific case. The fact that these appeals stretched on for 15 years, it really highlights the enduring tension in the U.S. legal system over juvenile culpability versus adult responsibility, especially when a crime is this cold-blooded and planned.
After going through all that extensive legal history, it's so vital that we bring our focus back to the young woman whose life was lost. Cassie Jo Stoddart was remembered by her community and her family as this vibrant student and friend. Her funeral on October 1st, 2006, had 500 people in attendance, which just reflects the deep shock and sorrow that was felt across Pocatello.
And her family, they channeled their grief into this really positive, community-focused initiative to honor her memory. It's known as Pumpkins for Cassie.
It's such a poignant gesture. Her grandmother and a friend, they set up a stand every year. And instead of selling pumpkins, they offer them to community members who make a donation to either the Pocatello Animal Shelter or the Idaho Food Bank.
The choice of those beneficiaries is particularly meaningful. It reflects causes that Cassie Jo really cared about, especially animal welfare. It's a way of keeping her spirit of generosity and care alive.
Beyond the community's remembrance, the Stoddart family also sought accountability through the civil court system. In 2010, they filed a civil lawsuit against the Pocatello School District.
Right. And the specific legal reasoning behind that was a claim of negligence. They argued that school officials should have been aware that Draper and Adamasic posed a threat to other students. The implication was that there was a failure to intervene or identify clear warning signs that could have prevented the tragedy. They were trying to establish institutional liability based on foreknowledge.
So how did the courts respond to that, to the very complex idea of foreseeability in a crime like this?
Both the civil court and eventually the Idaho's Supreme Court dismissed the case. They ruled definitively that the actions of the killers were not foreseeable. The level of secrecy, the planned nature of a thrill killing, the specific decision to target Cassie Jo outside of school, it all meant that, legally, the school could not reasonably have been expected to predict or prevent the specific criminal actions they took. It really demonstrates how difficult it is to hold third parties liable for these highly individualized, premeditated acts of violence.
This case, driven by all the sensational elements, the youth of everyone involved, the Scream connection, that chilling self-documented video evidence, It's naturally gotten extensive public interest and media coverage over the years.
It really has. It's been featured repeatedly on nearly every major true crime program. Dateline has revisited the facts multiple times, including a 2024 segment called The Secret in Black Rock Canyon, which just confirms how much public fascination there still is with the evidence recovery.
And other shows, too. Your Worst Nightmare, Copycat Killers, A Time to Kill. They've all dedicated episodes to analyzing the crime and that copycat element. And there was the 2013 documentary Lost for Life, which critically examines the ethics of sentencing juveniles to life without parole. It featured both Draper and Adam Bresic.
The case also led to several books. Tori Adamsick's mother, Shannon Adamsick, self-published a book called The Guilty Innocent in 2012, offering her perspective. And another book was published in 2015, Mormon sons Brian Draper and Tori Adamsick.
And one of the most significant recent developments in the public documentation of this happened in 2023. Using the Idaho Public Records Act, the full tape recordings and the transcripts made by Draper and Adamsick were publicly released, which allows for this unprecedented, though very disturbing opportunity for researchers and the public to examine the direct, unedited mental state and planning of the perpetrators.
And finally, we should just briefly mention the connection this case had to a separate, high-profile murder trial. Draper and Adamsick were called to testify in the 2024 trial for the 2004 murder of Norrie Jones. The defense was trying to argue that investigators might have overlooked other possible suspects, but in the end, neither Draper nor Adamsick actually took the stand in that trial.
This whole detailed history, the planning, the execution, the irrefutable evidence, the long legal battles, it brings us to a final analysis of the significance of this tragedy.
The recovered video footage really remains the most significant legal and societal element of this whole thing. It moves the conversation beyond just speculating about motive. The perpetrators documented their intent to murder and explicitly outlined a motive of sadism and thrill-seeking designed for fame. This documentation provided irrefutable proof of the cold, calculated, and malicious nature of the murder. It confirmed the premeditation needed for the life sentences, and, as we saw in the appeals, it significantly impacted how the judiciary viewed their potential for rehabilitation.
The documentation just strips away any possible argument of it being accidental or impulsive. It reveals a meticulously cold plan to replicate and exceed cinematic and real-world horrors. It's an absolute tragedy, the senseless loss of Cassie Jo Stoddart's young life, cut short by classmates who were seeking notoriety through a violent copycat crime.
This case really stands as a stark example of the dangers that are inherent in the pursuit of negative fame, and the powerful destructive influence that media obsession can have on vulnerable minds.
Absolutely. This case, which is so explicitly linked to cinematic violence and previous real-world tragedies like Columbine, it raises an important final question for you to consider long after we've finished analyzing these sources. When the perpetrators of a crime actively seek to document their motives for fame, like Draper and Adamsick did, does that documentation fundamentally change how the judicial system views the weight of premeditation? Or does it simply confirm what we already suspected about the nature of cold-blooded murder?
That challenged the killer as their own documentarian. That's something that will continue to influence our justice system.
Thank you for joining us for the systematic examination of the sources related to the murder of Cassie Jo Stoddart.
We appreciate you taking the time to review this material with us.
Thanks for listening.